Religious preachers, gurus, prophets, philosophers, and ideologues, history has them all. If you are going to explore the Tao of Holy Orthodoxy, the original ancient Christian path, a good question is, why should you listen to Jesus? Who is this first century Jewish teacher from Palestine that we who live in the 21st century should recognize his authority and follow him? One of my favorite stories is a 2,000-year-old account of two travelers walking on a road. Both these men had been disciples of Jesus before his death. As they walked toward the town of Emmaus from Jerusalem, where their master had been publicly executed a few days earlier, they talked about what had happened. A third man, whom they didn't recognize, approached them and asked them what they were talking about with such heavy sadness. One of the two, Cleopas was his name, answered, "Are you just a visitor in Jerusalem? Don't you know what has happened these past few days?" "What things?" the stranger asked. The disciples explained that they were talking about this prophet, Jesus of Nazareth, who did and said amazing things. God was with him. They had hoped that their teacher would free the people from Roman oppression, but the religious authorities, accusing him of blasphemy and treason, turned him in to the Roman occupiers. Jesus was condemned to death and crucified. Then a few of the women among the disciples went to the tomb and found the tomb open, but his body was gone. These women came back from the tomb and reported to the gathered disciples that they had seen a vision of angels who announced that Jesus was alive. After hearing this, a couple other disciples ran to the tomb and found it as the women had described. Now, at first, the stranger didn't seem to know anything about what the two disciples were talking about, which is why the disciples told the story. But after the disciples finished their story, this same stranger began educating the disciples. Drawing together the various writings of ancient Scripture, he explained how everything Jesus experienced in the last several days had been part of the grand, divine, heavenly plan, which had been unfolding throughout human history until finding its fulfillment in that particular time and place. As the three men neared the village of Emmaus, the two disciples tried to convince their new friend to stay with them, since it was already late in the day. He had seemed intent on going further, but agreed. Later, as they all sat at a table together, the one who had seemed like a stranger to them earlier took bread in his hands, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to the two disciples. Then suddenly their eyes were opened so that they recognized him. The man who had been with them all along was their master, who had kept the eyes of the disciples from recognizing him. But as soon as they saw that it was Jesus, he disappeared. The disciples then said to one another, "When he talked to us on the road and opened to us the meaning of Scripture, didn't the sense of the warming fire come in our hearts?" Then they ran quickly back to Jerusalem and found the other disciples together, saying, "It's true, the Lord is risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two disciples told the others what they had experienced on the road and how Christ had revealed himself through the breaking of the bread. All these things happened after Jesus had been publicly executed and was raised from the dead after 3 days in the tomb. Before his death, Jesus miraculously healed the sick, and not long before his bodily resurrection to immortality, he restored his friend Lazarus back to mortal life after Lazarus had been dead. Whoever wants to experience freedom from death and the fullness of life should take Christ and his way, the Orthodox way, very seriously. Understand this. Jesus Christ is not just a teacher who brought his life into harmony with the Tao, attained enlightenment, and learned to harness the power of life itself. I mean, Jesus is not a Palestinian Buddha or a Jewish Jedi or a character in a comic superhero cinematic universe. These accounts recorded in Scripture are not reworked mythologies. They are eyewitness accounts anchored in history. And the story of Christ being encountered by his disciples show that he is the resurrected Lord and teaches us how he can show us how we benefit from the Tao. When you start reading a book or watching movies or following a series on TV, If you jump in toward the end, you may misunderstand the central point of the story, and you miss this beautiful tapestry of intertwining meaning. So to learn about Christ and why the Orthodox way matters and how it changes lives, we need to know our shared human story from way back, as far as we can go, back to the beginning, in the beginning.